want to add a little bit of extra pizzazz to the binding on your quilt, today I'm going to show you how to add rickrack into the binding and be able to sew it on and finish it off all by machine. So we're going to work on a small project today with binding on a mug rug with a smaller size rickrack. The jumbo rickrack works really nice on your larger quilts. But for the video, I'm just going to do a little bit of a smaller one. So we're using a medium-sized rickrack, and it's going to give you a nice little 3D effect that is around the edge of your project. With the smaller rickrack, we don't have to worry about having anything extra on the inside of our binding to be able to bring it over to cause a problem with the loops pushing out on the binding. This is a leftover piece from the larger quilt that I did. And as you can tell on here, I did trim out the extra loops on my binding on this inside so that they don't cause any ripple effect when I fold my binding over. So you may have to do that on larger rickrack pieces. We're going to just use a medium-sized rickrack to go around this mug rug today as an example. So I am going to start with my binding strip. Now this binding strip is 2.5 inches wide by the width of my fabric. I've already prepared it by pressing it in half, wrong sides together, down the length of this strip. I only need one strip for this particular project. If you are making a larger project, you're going to have multiple strips of binding that you're going to end up sewing together end to end on a 45-degree angle to make enough binding to go around your entire project. So this one is already folded in half, and what my goal is by using my smaller rickrack is I want the fold of my binding to be down through the center line of my rickrack. And so when we sew this on, I'm going to actually have my rickrack down on the bed of my machine, and I'm going to be putting my fold of my binding down the center of that and on top and sewing through the fold of the binding. That gives me my stitch line. When I do start this, I want to have about 4 inches from the end before I start sewing the rickrack on. I need that extra there in order to combine my binding, piece my binding at the very end as I come around the last part of the mug rug and finish it off. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with about 4 inches out of the binding and the rickrack on the machine, and I am going to line up this fold of my binding to the center part of my rickrack, okay? And then I can open up my binding and I can start sewing down on that fold line. Okay, I do like to fold my binding back and line it up down through the center of my rickrack as I go. And that way I can just sew a little ways and then realign where that fold and the rickrack line up. We're going to continue that down, just line it up here. And you could even fold it down like this and line it up, and then reach underneath and hold your rickrack down and open that up and stitch through that fold line. We're going to go down this entire length until we get approximately 4 inches from the other end. Sometimes on darker fabric, that fold line on your binding is difficult to see. If you need to use a marker, a chalk marker, a fabric marker, and mark that center line for yourself, then that is perfectly acceptable. If you have a machine with a laser light, you could also set your laser light to go right down the center of that fold. Okay, that is as far as I'm going to go, and I'm going to go ahead and stop at that point. So I'm approximately 4 inches from the end. It is going to be easiest to apply this to my mug rug if I go ahead and repress this so that I end up with a ridge on the top, and then I have my binding strip sewn like this. So I'm going to press this. And basically you're pressing it back on that fold line of your binding that you already had in there. You can just make sure that everything is nice and smooth out. You can use the tip of your iron to push that away from the rickrack so you keep that crease in there. Okay, so now I can apply this to my mug rug. Now I am going to apply this starting on the back side of the mug rug and apply it just as if it was a regular binding with my raw edges together. The trick on this is that you want to be able to have enough room down here to join my pieces when I get done, and I want to be able to have my stitch line that you see, my thread that I see from sewing the rickrack onto the binding. I want to see that on the top here when I'm applying this binding, because then once I sew it on and bring it around to the front, I don't see that thread anymore, and I have a ditch that I can stitch that binding down with. So I'm going to make sure that I am beyond the starting point of where I put that rickrack on my binding, and I'm going to be fairly close to this corner over here. My mug rug is fairly small, and so I want to maximize my space that I have in here in order to join those binding strips together at the end. So I will start about 2 inches from the corner, and I am going to apply a heavy 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's not going to be 1/4 and it's not going to be 3/8. It's going to be just a little bit bigger. I have to get beyond my stitch line where I started, and that is right here. So I want to make sure I'm just a little bit beyond that before I get started stitching this. Okay. I am not using a walking foot on this because I have fairly flat batting in this mug rug, and it's very heavily quilted with an embroidery design. I actually quilted it on the embroidery machine. So I'm not in fear of anything pushing out of alignment. And so I'm using just my regular 1/4 inch foot for this purpose. So I'm going to go ahead and sew within a seam allowance of the corner, and I'm going to double check it by turning it and checking where my lineup is on the edge of my foot. Once I do that, I'm going to go ahead and back stitch off and pull it out and do my fold. Now your fold is just like you would a regular 90-degree fold on here. It's just that you have rickrack on the edge. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that down and fold it, and you can see my rickrack is up on the edge here, So it's my regular 90-degree fold to make that a mitered corner. And we're going to continue to the next corner. If you need more detailed information or video on putting a binding on with the corners like this, we do have a video on YouTube as well for a basic binding. Once I turn this last corner, I'm only going to stitch a couple of inches in and I'm going to stop, because I need that room again to finish off this binding. So when I get ready, I'm going to have my rickrack loose on here, and I'm going to measure this out to finish off my binding. So I'm going to fold this back a little bit. Now on this particular one, I can do a 45-degree join, or I can do a straight across join on my binding. So I'm going to lay this down and I'm going to mark exactly where those two pieces of binding match up. And so if you see on there, I have my fold from my first part of my binding, that is here, and then I put a pin right where those two join and fold that second part of that binding coming over, so that I know exactly where those two are going to line up. Okay, and at this point I can make a choice whether to join that straight across or join it on a 45-degree angle. I'm going to choose to join this particular one straight across. So that means that I only need a 1/2 inch of an overlap, because I'm going to join that on a 1/4 inch seam. So I am going to remove the rickrack from the piece coming around about 1/2 inch in or so, or 3/4 inch away from where that seam is going to join. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I am actually going to do a real quick press of that fold, so I can put that fold together and know exactly where they're going to join. Once I do that, I'm going to trim this 1/4 inch away from this fold line. So my 1/4 inch, and I can take a measuring device here and I can measure that 1/4 inch and put a little snip in it. Okay. So that I have that marked. There's a little snip right here, and that's 1/4 of an inch away from my fold line that is right here. So I'm going to do that on both sides of this binding. So once I have that mark there, I know I can trim that away. And I'm going to do that real quick and I'll be right back. Okay, I now have my 2 pieces trimmed so that I have 1/4 of an inch seam on each one. So I'm going to now join these. This causes me a problem here because it pulls against my binding as I'm trying to sew that together. So I'm going to take this mug rug, fold it in half, and I'm going to put a pin there to keep it contained so I can work with these 2 tails that I have here. And I'm going to sew those together with a 1/4 inch seam. Now keep in mind that I have my rickrack out of the way. I am not sewing my rickrack into that seam. If I sew it into the seam, then it does not allow me to bring that over to the top and make it a nice finish. So we have to deal with the rickrack all on its own. Okay, now I have my binding piece together. I'm going to do a quick press of that seam open so that if I press it open, that reduces the bulk as I pull that around and fold that binding in half. If I remove my pin, then I can bring this back around and I can do another quick press of that binding strip in half. And it will fit right into that space I need it to fit into. Now I need to deal with this rickrack. So what I want to do with the rickrack is I also want to piece that together in a seam, but I don't want it to be in the same spot as my previous seam. So I'm going to bring it over a little ways here, and I'm going to check and see where those 2 would line up in order to get the best seam so that it doesn't look like I actually pieced that together. And I have a great spot right here where my 2 loops will come together, and I can piece it right here. So I went ahead and pressed that with the iron, and then I can line these pieces up on that fold, and I can do a quick stitch right through that. Once again, in order to work with that, I need to get the rest of this out of the way. So I will pin it together so I just have my rickrack. And I can realign my fold here. My fold line is right here. So I'm just going to do a quick stitch through that fold line. Once I have done that, then I can trim that rickrack away from that seam line. Now, if I trim it just perfect here, then this will fold back on itself and it will be hidden away when I do my final stitching. So I'm going to get that piece cut out of there, and that will fold back on itself here. And this one will fold back on itself over here. So we'll get those both trimmed out. And remove that pin. Okay, so this is what I have so far at my joining spot. I have my seam for my rickrack here, and I have my seam for my binding over here. But now we need to reapply my rickrack to my binding fold. So that will be my next step, is to open this back up and do that last stitching onto the binding. And I can see where my fold of my binding is, and this particular one I'm going to do from the top side. So let's make sure that we keep that lined up where I trimmed the rickrack and down through the center. It's a little bit more of a challenge right here, but open that up and lay it flat on your machine and make sure that one lays flat. I'm going to grab a pin and get that realigned in there because I want to make sure that that is hidden in there. Okay, once I have done that step, trim my little thread here, and I'm going to press that again. So I keep going back to the pressing to make sure that my edges are staying where I want them to be. So okay, on this board, if you can see then where I join the rickrack and I join the binding over here. So I've got those tails tucked into my rickrack. So hopefully when you get all done, nobody is going to know exactly where you join that. I do have a little tiny piece here. I'm just going to trim that before I put that into the final step. So once I've done that, now I need to finish sewing this binding onto the mug rug, and it should all fit nicely into space there. Okay, so I've got that all sewn in. Now the easy way to handle this when you get ready to stitch it onto the front side is go ahead and take your iron and press that binding from the back side out. If you are using anything except cotton batting, then you're not going to want to do this step because it flattens your batting. You can do it with fleece, you can do it with your cotton battings, but if you have any sort of fluffy batting, you're not going to want to do this step. So I have pressed this out now away from the edge of where I sewed that binding onto the back side. And now it makes it much easier to pull that binding to the top and do your top stitching. What we're going to do is we're going to just cover our stitch line from when we applied our binding, and we're going to stitch down in the middle of this rickrack piece here, right in the ditch. So you're not going to see that stitching at all when you get done. Now I do advise that you use a matching thread to your rickrack so that you do not see that. And you can use a matching thread then on the back side that matches the backing of whatever you are making. So as we continue here, when I get to this corner here, I'm going to press that nice and flat out like this. Okay. I'm going to place a pin here and hold that binding in place as I approach that corner. Now I have found that if I push this bottom one up first, it makes it easier to fold this corner. So I'm going to bring up that bottom area, which is the next side I'm going to go down. So I'm going to bring that up and I'm going to put a pin in here to hold that into place. And then I can tuck that corner. We'll move this pin a little bit and I can tuck this corner in. And when I tuck that corner, then my edges of my rickrack should line up and make a nice corner area there. And as I come up to that intersection, I'm going to remove that first pin holding everything in place and stop with my needle right down in that intersection, that point, and I'm going to bring it around and continue down to the next corner. Now I'll come down to this corner and I'll actually take this out of the machine and show you that fold so you can see it a little more close up. So what I'm going to do here is I'm coming down this side of my binding. So I'm going to take this bottom edge, that is going to be the next side I sew down, and I'm going to place a pin in here to hold that in its place. So I need to have this out of the way so it doesn't fight with me. So I'm going to push my corner in with my thumb, push it to the back. I'm going to bring this piece out and I can put a pin in there to hold that one in place. Then when I do this fold here at this corner, this side that I'm coming down should fit really nicely to give me an intersection right here at the point. So where I have it folded right here is going to line up with the fold I have on this other side. And so if I pin this in place here, then I'm going to stitch right down to the corner here, okay, and put my needle down and pivot and then come down this other side so I make a nice corner there for my stitching. I don't want to sew over any pins, so as I approach this, I'm going to remove that pin. I'm going to stop with my needle right in that corner, and my other pin is on the side, so it is not in my way. So I'm going to turn that corner, and then I'm going to continue down the next side. And remember that you're stitching in the ditch, which the ditch is on the rickrack side of your binding. bottom part up. Another pin closer to the corner. Tuck and fold. Place another pin to hold that first corner, the first side, into place. The presser foot, if you get close enough, the presser foot will hold that, and then you'll be able to remove that pin. And this will be my final corner. And do double check as you approach that intersection of where you piece that rickrack. If there's any extra threads hanging out there, then now is the time to trim them back so that you don't see them. And I will be on my final stitches here. And I'm all done putting the rickrack binding around the edge of this mug rug. And so I have a nice little fun 3D effect that is all the way around the edge and just sparks up any project. If you have any questions, you can contact us through the store phone at 406-655-1001. You can also send us messages on our Facebook page or through our email through our website at www.backdoorquiltshop.com. Shop is S-H-O-P-P-E. Thank you and have a great day.